Good morning, Rabbotai. Let us dedicate a few words of Torah. Today is Sunday. The year is 2012. January the 1st. So I'm supposed to say Happy New Year. Well, why not? We could say Happy New Commercial Year. And we wish everyone to have a very good year, commercially, financially, and everything. But the subject that I would like to expound today, maybe in honor of the Happy New Year, is regarding the word bechi, crying. Is it because maybe the Jewish people, maybe I shouldn't say that the new year, the new commercial year, in fact, the last 2,000 years were very costly to the Jewish people because of that which instigated the new year, the new commercial year. You know, since then, Am Israel is boche, is crying. Aren't we? And now we are hoping that the end of the crying is coming to an end. You know, the Jewish people has cried for generations and generations, whether it is because of the misfortune that has come upon us, the terrible tragedies, or the kind of crying that we address to the Lord, that He should send us the Mashiach, He should give us His salvation. And the Jewish people cries and cries and cries. We even have a special wall, the Western Wall in Yerushalayim, that we call the Wall of Lamentations. That's the wall of tears of Am Israel. The wall itself became a heart, the heart of the Jewish people. Why is that? Because the Jewish people cries all the time. Because since we lost Bet HaMikdash 2,000 years ago, all we have is crying to the Lord all the time. And hopefully, like the Prophet said, Bila'am mavet lanetzach, umaha Hashem Elokim dim'a me'al kol panim. We ask the Hashem that He should swallow forever death, and He should wipe out all the tears that we have shed in this world. So, that's the introduction regarding the Happy New Year. And let's hope we'll be even happier. Be'ezrat Hashem, we are happy with our Torah, we are happy with our mitzvot, we are happy being Jewish, we are proud of it, and we will not relinquish this great merit that we have to be born a Jew for no price in the world. But since we have tackled the idea of that very instinctive, very natural excretion that are the tears that the body releases, we call it bechi, crying. What is bechi? What is this function that the body has? This biological function that the body has, that we call crying. This kind of phenomenon, it's a phenomenon. It's a miracle that God created, that we should cry. Why is it? Number one, let us tell you several reasons why God created this function of the human body to cry. Number one, everybody knows. The main reason why we cry, you want to know? It's a chesed. It's a kindness of Hashem that He gave us the possibility to cry. Because crying, did you ever see such a thing? That when somebody cries, why does he cry? Why do we cry? Because there is something difficult upon him. Let's say he lost his job, or he's sick. That's what we call in Hebrew metzukah. He has some kind of annoyance, so he cries. So as soon as you cry, you feel a certain relief. You feel better after you cry. Whether one cries for the dead, or cries for illness, or cries for all kinds of hard circumstances, when you cry, you feel a relief. So that's number one, why God created by nature the crying mechanism. You cry because Hashem wants to help us to contend with the Metzuka, with that difficult thing that happened upon us. You cry, you feel better. But I'll tell you a second reason why God created the Bechi, the crying, the tears. Why? לפשט עקמומיות של הלב. There's a certain Gemara in Masechet Ta'anit that tells us, why is it that we have thunder? Why did God create the thunder before, that explosive sound, before the rain falls? Because that sound scares us. Because it scares us, so it mefashet akmumiyut. You see, our heart is twisted with the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara does not let us be the way we want to be. Many times he brings into your mind bad thoughts that completely disconnect you from Kedusha. You want Kedusha, but your mind doesn't like that. That's Yetzer Hara. That's called akmumiyut shebalev, the twisting of the heart. So Hashem created several things that help us to iron the akmumiyut, the twisting of the heart. One of them is crying. When you are crying, it straightens those twisted things that we have. At the time of crying, there's no Yetzer Hara. You're crying, you are practically becoming somehow, there is some kind of tahara, some kind of purity in you when you cry. Agree or not? Do you agree? It makes you become better when you cry. Everybody will agree to that. And the third reason why Hashem created crying is because the source of crying is very pure. Because at that time, you know what? Anything that we do is afflicted by the problem of ga'ava. Whether it is jealousy or hatred, everything stems from ga'ava. But here is one good minute in which a person is free from ga'ava, the time when he cries. The time when you cry, at that time there is no ga'ava, there is no haughtiness, there is no conceit. You don't feel superior when you cry, right? You don't feel, there is no arrogance when you cry. So you have a minute of absolutely no arrogance, no ga'ava. That's wonderful. So crying is again another reason why it's great. If one knows how to use crying with Hashem, he becomes extremely powerful. You know, Mishi yodea leithatte, like Honiam Agel. When the Rabban Gamliel says if he was not happy with him, but he says, what can I do that you know how to cry before the Lord? So he does whatever you want. So if one can use his tears to address Hashem, then he will be extremely powerful, because he will be capable of opening the gates that were closed, or the partitions that have separated him from Hashem. So what is crying? Crying makes you closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because you become instantly tahor. Even if it is for 1 minute of crying, at that time you are pure. So therefore, immediately you are connected again with the source of purity. Is it too much for you, Moshe, those words? Okay. We all know what the Gemara says, that when Bet HaMikdash was destroyed, Sha'aret Tfilah nin'alu, the gates of prayer were closed. Which the Mefarshim explain what does it mean? It means that the Jewish people almost gave up. After they saw the destruction of the temple, it's like they didn't see why should they pray anymore. And I explained this in a different time, that Anshe Knesset HaGedolah came back, and they brought back again the feelings, the good feelings, and then again the feelings of emunah, of belief, was reinstated in the hearts of the Jewish people. And what do we say since then? What? We say in Tehillim, Al Naharot Bavel, שם ישבנו, גם בכינו בזוכרנו את ציון. Now we can cry over the memory of Zion when we had Bet HaMikdash. Al Naharot Babel, that was, which means on the rivers of Babel, when they went to Babel after the destruction of the temple. But Sha'arei Dim'a, Sha'arei Tfilah nin'alu, the gates of prayers were closed for a while. But then Sha'arei Dim'a, the tears, the gates of tears opened up all the partitions. So you see again, another proof that crying and the tears are extremely powerful to destroy any partition that there could be between us and Hashem. Now, crying is a witness to the fact that we are weak. Am I right or not? זה מעיד על חולשתו הטבעית של האדם, which means we are born with a weak nature. What testifies to that? The crying. So therefore, why is that necessary? It's necessary to teach us from time to time. Why should we be ba'ale ga'ava? For what do you think? Who do you think you are? There are moments in which you are crying, and this exhibits your weakness. If you see the exhibition of your weakness, why would you become ba'al ga'ava? Why would you be arrogant? So that's another reason why crying is important. It's a way how to teach us to learn to be humble. Another reason why crying is important. Crying, the בכי, מגלה שביסודו האדם הוא טוב. See, the Torah says, כי יצר לב האדם רע מנעוריו. Hashem created an evil inclination in us since the day we are born. So, does that mean that the Torah means to say that we are bad by nature? No, it means that we have an inclination to evil because of the Yetzer Hara. But the original source of the human, of the Adam, the human being, is good. The source is good. The source is pure. What is the proof? The proof is from time to time you cry. It shows that in its origin, in its source, in its roots, the human being is good. That's why human beings, Jews or not, they all do chesed. They all have compassion. Where do they get this? They have an original root and source that testifies to the fact that we are really good. Only, ba'avonot harabim, the evil inclination spoils it for us and ruins us. And we become evil. But the crying from time to time reminds us, you have the possibility to be good. It's in you. Otherwise you wouldn't cry. A person who never cries is a hard man. Is a person that is hard. I mean, don't we know the story of Rabbi Azar ben Durdeya, who sinned all the abominations of the world, the Gemara tells us. Right? And Rabbi Azar ben Durdeya, he was not Rabbi, because he was a big sinner. Anyone would have said nothing would help this guy. One day he realized that he exaggerated. So what did he do? He sat down and he cried and he cried and he cried till he died. And then a heavenly voice came from heaven saying, Rabbi. They even gave him a title of Rabbi. Rabbi Azar ben Azariah is welcome in Olam Abba, in Gan Eden. You see what crying has done? The crying brings the person closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, no matter how thick and impure were the partitions between him and God. Another reason why crying was important, because anybody who cries, you look at him, what happens when you see somebody crying? Immediately you are willing to help him. Immediately you sympathize with him. Immediately you like him. When a person cries, you like him. That's the normal, that's the nature. Why is that? Because when you cry, حوت الحسد مشوخ على البناv. There's a thread of kindness that comes upon his face. It's very important. But that's not the issue. All this is only an introduction. Because all this until now is instinctive. All the kinds of cries that we have described now are in fact instinctive. They were born with us. What is really the kind of cry that Hashem evaluates with tremendous importance? Now, even the natural one is good, especially if we use it to address the Lord, as I said before. If you address the Lord with your crying, that's not a natural one. That's your instigation. I'm going to explain that. We find in the Gemara many times all kinds of sipurim, all of stories about big rabbis who cried. Let's go to the biggest, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Gemara tells us in Masechet Berachot, I think it is page Samach, and there Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was before his death, and his Talmidim came to visit him, and they found him crying. So they thought maybe he is afraid to die. They said to him, Rabbi, Master, the candle of Am Yisrael, the great hammer. They referred to him by all kinds of titles, expressing their admiration to their old and venerated and revered master. He says, Amud Aymini, Patish Chazak, why are you crying? Are you afraid maybe? He said to them, I shouldn't cry. Of course I am crying. I am about to leave the world, and I don't know which way they are taking me. There are two ways, one that leads to Gehinnom, and one leads to Gan Eden. I don't know which way they are taking me. You don't want me to cry? Of course I'm crying, because I'm worried. Imagine, the greatest rabbi of Am Yisrael was worried, and therefore he cried over the terrible anxiety that he had, not knowing. So what should we say? If he was not sure which way they are taking him, what should we say? And we don't even try to cry over that. But he cried. And that testifies to the fact that he was the greatest tzaddik. Only a tzaddik can cry over that. That's not the natural cry. That's another kind of cry. That's the kind of cry that makes you become a tzaddik. Now we can start talking. Yesterday's parasha, we read about Yosef HaTzadik. You know, I counted before the Kahal yesterday 8 times, and I'm sure there is at least one more, in which the Torah tells me that Yosef cried. Again, I'm going to repeat something that I always say. Anything that is natural and instinctive, the Torah never mentions. Torah never mentions something that comes by instinct. Let's say somebody is crying because he has pain. The Torah will never write about this. Because why? That's instinctive. They have no value. And yet the Torah is telling us that Yosef HaTzadik cried so many times. Listen to this. In Parashat Miketz, for example, he says, "Vaymaher Yosef ki nichmeru rachama velachi vayvakesh livkot." And Yosef, when he saw his brothers, he had his heart filled up with compassion for them, and he wanted to cry. Here is one instance. There it says, "Vayevki Yosef bedaberam elav." When he was speaking to them, he wanted to cry. Second time. The third time, in Parashat Vayigash, we find several times in Parashat Vayigash. It says, "Vaynashek lechol ehav vayevk alehem." When he revealed his identity to them, he started to kiss them and he cried. Again, he is crying. It says, "Vaypol al tzavere Binyamin achiv vayevk." That when he saw his brother Binyamin, he hugged him and he cried over him. Why is it that the Torah is telling me all kinds of things like this that are unnecessary? You tell me that Yosef is crying, and what a big crier he is. A big crier. He cries all the time. Look, 8 times the Torah is telling me that, even further, even in Parashat Vayhi, it says, "Vayafog libo." I'm sorry. It says that when he spoke with his father, again he cried, and again before he died, and so forth. It's not the time now, but I tell you, at least 8 times the Torah mentions that Yosef HaTzadik is crying, and we know that the Torah does not mention any time. It does not mention the fact of crying when crying is natural and instinctive? So why is it? I asked him a personal question myself yesterday. I said, my goodness, he cried, I understand. Remember when we spoke last week, we said that when he cried over Benhaim, what was that Rashi comes and he ruins the whole impression. Why? Because he says he was not crying over Benhaim per se. So what was he crying about? He was crying over the two Bet HaMikdash that in the future, in his future, would be destroyed, and those Bet HaMikdash were built on the portion that was allotted to Benhaim. Therefore, Yosef was crying. And Benhaim also cried over the Mishkan Shiloh that is in the portion of Yosef. So now, Rashi, we should ask a question. Why do you have to tell me this? Isn't this natural that when he saw his brother, he would cry? Why do you have to ruin this whole the story by telling me he cried over something that is not here yet? What do we do? So, that's the point. The point is that Rashi wanted to tell me that Yosef is not crying over something that is natural, instinctive, such as seeing his brother that he didn't see for 20 years and more. He cried over something more important. That's why the Torah mentions it. Otherwise, if he cried just because he was moved to see his brother, the Torah would not mention it. And you know what is the proof? I'm going to prove it to you. We all read the terrible story of Yosef being taken by his brothers and sold to slavery. Is there anything more sad than that? More tragic than that? Right? You have no idea how painful it was for Yosef. Did the Torah mention that he was crying when he was taken away when he was thrown into the well? I'm sure he was crying a lot, right? But did the Torah mention anything about it? Nothing. How come the Torah does not mention the fact that Yosef was crying when the pain was so great, and yet he's telling me all kinds of money, brother, this and that? The answer is, the Torah would never mention something because of pain, because that's already natural, instinctive. That's not the point. The Torah would mention only the cries of Yosef when they have a value, when there is something to say. I told them a story about our great uncle in the family, Rabbi Baruch Toledano alav shalom, that once I had the privilege to spend the night in his house because I couldn't find my other uncle, Rabbi Shlomo Toledano. So they took me to the house of Rabbi Baruch Toledano, and he insisted that I should eat with him, and I was only 16 years old. But I had a nice voice, so he wanted me to sing. So I sang for him, and he was very, very much happy, Baruch Hashem. And then he asked me to spend the night there. When I spent the night there, in the middle of the night I hear someone crying. Crying. Oh my God, I said, who is this? Then I realized this is Rabbi Baruch Toledano himself who's crying. About what? Then I realized he's doing Tikkun Hatzot, and he's crying over the destruction of Bet HaMikdash. One question came up to my mind. I even wrote it since then in my writings. I said, how is it possible that this cry sounds so sincere? It was really crying. Over what? Over something that happened 2,000 years ago? How is it possible? It's not normal. I understand people cry over something that happens to them on the spot. But to cry over a very important thing of our history that happened 2,000 years ago, you have to be a very special kind of person. That's the kind of cry that reveals the fact that you are a tzaddik. That's exactly what Yosef. That's why we call Yosef a tzaddik. Of course, we call him for other reasons, but one of the reasons is because he cried. What kind of cries? Not the cry of instinct and natural, that he does anyway. But he cries because he prays to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He cries over the fact that he brings himself to crying. You see, our crying is a natural, something that happens automatically. You are sad, you cry. But that's not what the Torah is talking about. The Torah is talking about the kind of cry that you develop, that you bring yourself into tears. Let's say a person does teshuvah. He says, Hashem, please forgive me. And he does the vidui. And little by little he brings himself into tears. That's a tear that is valued. Like the Gemara says, for example, when a tzaddik dies, one should cry. When a tzaddik dies, when a big rabbi dies, he should cry. כל הבוכה על אדם כשר, יש לו חלק לעולם הבא. והשם סופר את אותם הדמעות. When somebody cries over a kosher man who passed away, those tears are counted by the Almighty. And the guy is good for olam haba. And the question is, what's the connection? Connection is, if you cried over a tzaddik, it means there is something good in you. There's many things that are good in you. Therefore, you probably are a person who is deserving olam haba. No question about it. So that's the kind of bechi that we are talking about. There's a small story that I would like to inject here, that they found out just a few years ago, that there was an old lady who, when she wrote the tzava'ah for her children, she dedicated all her money for all her grandchildren. Let's say she had 20 grandchildren. Each grandchild received $10,000. But there was one grandchild who received 20,000. And they all didn't understand why. Why he was singled out by getting double than all of them. She was still alive when she did that. So they came and asked her, why? Why did you favor her? She said, because I remember when I told you the story of the Holocaust that she went through the Holocaust in Germany. So she was telling the story to all her grandchildren. All of them were moved, but there was only one of them that really cried over the story. She said, if he cried over my story, that means he was more concerned than all of them for me, for what I suffered. Therefore, he deserves to have more. See the power of crying? Crying shows that you are more sincere. Another person could be moved, but doesn't mean total sincerity. Sincerity is when you cry. So now let me conclude with the following. Since the battery is going to be consumed, so might as well make a big story very small. What can we do? Today's generation is problematic. The young generation. America and the modern world have done something that is a big mistake. They are teaching the world not to punish the children. Now, what am I saying? Just by mentioning this, I'm already ugly in the eyes of people. Just a few years ago, I remember, teachers in school, they punished the student. Sometimes the teacher would give, he had the stick and he would even give one or two slaps. The father slapped us. The mother slapped us. Not too much though. King Solomon himself said, "Hosech shifto soneh beno." If you don't give the stick to your child, you hate him. But unfortunately, the modern world is teaching us, don't touch the children. Don't punish them. Don't rebuke them. Don't let them grow strong and independent. That's right, they will grow strong and independent. But you know what they will be missing? They will be missing crying. Because one of the reasons why we cry is for the purpose to become better. And if you don't punish a child, he's going to grow. Oh yes, he will cry over things of his own interest. Let's say when a child doesn't receive something that he wanted, and he's spoiled, and he starts crying over that. That's crying of rish'ut. Because he's an egotist. He wants, give it to me, and he starts to cry. That's not the crying that we are looking for. We are trying to expound the point of crying for the sake of education. While knowing that one should not, chas v'shalom, be brutal and aggressive towards his children, but it is necessary and important to provide punishment. Sometimes you have to tell him you don't get your allowance a whole week. Or sometimes you have to be angry at him. You have to show him anger. Sometimes you punish him by not talking to him. Sometimes you even have to scare him and to threaten him that he will lose certain things. Sometimes you have to slap. Not much, but a little. But here today they tell you don't do that. In the old time, not too far behind us, they used to do that. In schools, since when the teacher was afraid to touch the student? Today, if the teacher is caught punishing the student, he'll go to jail. Today, the children go to the police to tell them that their parents have beaten them. Oh, modernity, okay, modern age. But you have to understand, while we are sure that the children have grown independently, but at the same time they have lost a very important aspect of life. They have lost the opportunity to cry. Because if you don't cry enough, you don't develop a good heart. A good heart is being developed only when a child cried somehow during his youth, during his when he was still young. Crying makes a person better. And that's the reason why today's the young generation doesn't have much heart. They don't have a heart. Oh yes, they are wonderful also in many ways. They tell you the young age is wonderful. It is true. They'll help, but they will not have concern when it's difficult for them. For that they have to have a developed sense of compassion. And you cannot have a developed sense of compassion if you did not cry a little during your life. That's what crying makes you become. You become a person who is concerned about others, who understands the plight of others. When you ask them, please come and help me, they will come not because they have an interest, because they understand you are in a problematic situation. That is possible only when the children have learned to cry. And that's what this generation, I think, with exceptions of course, there are exceptions in everything. But I think this is one of the losses of this generation. And the old generations were correct, even though we do not, chas v'shalom, agree with being brutal or aggressive to the children. Our sages said you are allowed to be angry if you are still in control of yourself, if you don't lose your temper. But once you lose your temper, you are not allowed to touch anybody. You are not allowed to rebuke, you are not allowed to beat anybody, you are not allowed to punish. Why? Because you are not really punishing, you are relieving yourself from your own anger. But if you are not angry, if you are conscientious of what you are doing, you are allowed to punish a little. So what? Maybe he'll cry. Very good, he'll become better because of that. Happy New Year.